I say it all the time on the show, and we cover this all the time. And Max said it perfectly in this tweet. You don't change Bitcoin. Bitcoin changes you. And in the news segment, they even covered what I believe to be true as well, that Bitcoin exposes you to you. And there's a certain aspect of Bitcoin that expands your consciousness. And I love how you guys put this in your Orange Pill podcast. You guys always use the psychedelic meme of full dose, microdosing, and overdosing on the orange pill. And I found this meme as well, or the next one is you guys put it really well, because as someone that has traveled the dimensions of my mind, I can agree that Bitcoin may be a better psychedelic than psychedelics. And you put it here: psilocybin mushrooms are no match for the mind expanding properties of the Orange Pill podcast, or the orange pill in general. But I really love how you put this tweet together right here, Max. And you go, Bitcoin takes you through 5 steps of consciousness raising by design. The path leads you from lowly gambling to spiritual enlightenment. And 99% of discussion still is on number 1. Number 1 being gambling, number 2 being investing, 3 being wealth preservation, 4 political activism, and 5 spiritual enlightenment. And you guys touched on it in the beginning, how Bitcoin will usher in the next renaissance, the next enlightenment. So my question to start off with is, how did you guys come to this realization yourself? Is it just going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, or is it just something that happens to you over time, that you come to this realization that Bitcoin changes your consciousness for the better?
Well, I think in my case, it's always been a lifelong pursuit to explore the unconscious and subconscious realms, probably because I was born in 1960 and grew up during the 60s, when Dr. Timothy Leary and others were talking about the properties of psychedelics. And a lot of the writers at that time, famous writers at that time, were talking about psychedelia. The music was exploring psychedelia. So I think that's part of my childhood. And even when I started on Wall Street in the 1980s, it was a time actually on Wall Street when it was transitioning from many decades of being a very boring job with fixed commissions to suddenly Charles Schwab came around and they had the discounters appeared, and Wall Street got really creative with, and it was the rise of the leveraged buyouts, the buyout kings, Michael Milken, and all kinds of interesting. And that was one of my first job coming out of college was as a stockbroker, and I was exposed to just this idea that money was a medium, like paint, dance, song, the written word. Money is a medium. The medium of exchange is not different than the medium of artistic expression. Whether it's paint or dance or poetry, it's a medium. And that medium can take an infinite form. So, and I had a career on Wall Street with that kind of mentality. And I had a book of clients who actually kind of appreciated my take on that, believe it or not. So when I went on to the 90s and I created the Hollywood Stock Exchange, and I invented a digital currency that's patented. And that was an attempt to turn everything that was in Hollywood into a tradable meme, a virtual security. So that was eventually sold to Cantor Fitzgerald. Then I discovered Bitcoin in 2011, and this was the discovery of all of these ideas expressed perfectly. So the concision of the white paper is the genius of the white paper. There's nothing new in Bitcoin. It's just an assembly of existing technologies, but in a perfect way. So in this way, it's almost like a haiku. You know, haiku is a very short poem. It's 3 lines, very limited number of syllables, but it resonates. It's perfect to a degree. With Bitcoin, it's the perfection of money and the medium of exchange as a medium perfected. So it tickles the psychedelic need that I think all humans have at some level of their sub or unconscious existence. There is a psychedelic thirst. for radical juxtaposition of ideas and images to create new truths. So truth, again, is subjective. This is the thing that journalists face all the time, is that the journalist tells the truth today, but tomorrow that truth may have changed. You can only tell the truth as it exists today, but there needs to be an effort to at least tell the truth as you see it today. The failure with journalism that we talked about earlier is that they go in there with a cooked story already and then bend the facts to go with the narrative. Same thing with Wall Street. You know, the problem with my technology, the virtual specialist technology, it really is a way to pick a price first and then add the trades later. And you see that on Wall Street now. And part of the problems on Wall Street is that the markets have been subjected to this form of manipulation where big banks like Goldman Sachs, they want the bond market to be a certain price. So they start printing trades at that price and then fill in the orders to support their preconceived notion of what the price should be. So it's the opposite of price discovery, where the price is the sum total of all the buyers and sellers in the market, and you have the current price. That doesn't exist anymore in any market in the world. All markets everywhere are the opposite. The price is determined first based on a narrative, and then trades are filled in afterward to justify that price. Now we're seeing that completely being unwound. It was supported by artificially cheap money, 0% interest rates, allowed you to do this perpetual fraud for many, many years. We've now entered a new era where prices for stuff are not going to be determined by this fraud on Wall Street, but by the people who produce the stuff. The commodity producers have now taken over in pricing stuff. And that's why suddenly stuff costs more, because for decades, the price of stuff was hidden by derivatives, by Wall Street, by financialization, and all the risk was shuffled around and it was dumped in places where it was never talked about. But now that era is over and we have a new era where the price of stuff is determined outside of America. It's determined where they produce the stuff, the commodities. So that's a very disjointed and long answer to your question about psychedelia. So I hope that the psychedelic nature of my answer reflects the spirit of which the question was posed.
I also want to say that's one good thing about being older than a lot of young people now entering Bitcoin is that Max and I have some memory. Max has more experience of the real, of when you talk about CBDCs and surveillance. We lived in a time where you could actually be a private human being, where you could express yourself, and it was essentially in privacy. It was not surveyed and recorded and put in your files for the rest of eternity, right? So when you're in the 70s, think about where Max grew up in New York City, what was going on, right? You had the Weather Underground bombing, like 2,000 federal buildings in the late 1960s, early 70s. Like shit was going on. Yeah, you had Times Square looking like Taxi Driver or that TV series The Deuce, and there were pimps and whores and sex shops. There were serial killers all over New York. There was murder, but there was also punk rock, and there was hip hop, and there was, you know, the beat poets still there. Like you had an incredible cauldron of creativity, and we don't have that anymore, right? Because everybody self-censors. And if they don't, they get deplatformed, so they aren't even part of the conversation, and they're disappeared from humanity, because the right to assembly, but also the right to privacy, are part of these enlightenment ideals, and for a reason, because that's where you cultivate creativity and innovation and ideas, and you know, part of that process is not, you know, you make a lot of mistakes. That's part of growth. That's part of creativity, is fucking up and making mistakes. But there's a lot of young Zoomers and millennials don't have that option, because everything is recorded for eternity in some digital space or some server in the NSA and Google and Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, and the part of the American entrepreneur, the American archetype, is somebody who gets up after having been knocked down, right? And actually, there's a great analogy to be made in the game of baseball, which is a uniquely American game, but I'm not going to go digress into my whole baseball analogy. But nevertheless, other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, if you make a mistake, you're stigmatized, and your career is cut off, and you're a loser. In the United States, we encourage mistakes. We say make as many mistakes as you want, because every mistake gets you closer to winning, right? And that means you can't have censorship imposed the way that it's being imposed now, and create the fear of mistakes as you do now. And this generation, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're being taught to fear making mistakes, which is the worst thing you could possibly do to any generation, because now they're going to become snitches.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Well, that's what in the psychedelic movement back in the 60s and 70s, it was about dropping out, right? Of that 50s and 60s sort of culture. And you might have seen in Mad Men some of the collision point there. And the horrible thing about it is that the boomers were the ones that did this. They were teenagers or young 20s at the time. They were the ones doing this. They were the ones blowing up federal buildings. Now they're the ones like deplatforming people and introducing CBDCs and telling you that you'll be happy if you own nothing. It's like they're the tyrants. They became all that they were dropping out to avoid. So it's just a new form of it. It's a new digital form of it. But they were coming out of the era of McCarthy and all the wars going on around the world, the Cold War and the proxy wars, like in places like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and all across Central America, of course. And so, they were dropping out. They were like exiting that system. Well, Bitcoin is exiting that system. It is exiting the man, right? Like it's sticking it to the man in the same way that the 60s attempted to do, but then they all started doing butter commercials and selling out themselves.
Gary Rubin was part of the Weather Underground, I think, or one of the major counterculture movements of the 60s. He became an investment banker, right? So a lot of that time, and it was, it was a brief period of self-expression and freedom, and then it became corporatized. The youth movement, became owned by corporations.
You used to be able to blow up a federal building and just like, go back to your day job or, drop out and just like go to a concert. Now it's all like big deal.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but,
I'm just joking. Don't
yeah. Stacy's just
hoping that
having a little humor there.
Get in trouble.
Some very interesting humor. But it's culturally speaking, Bitcoin is the acid of this century. Instead of dropping acid, you can just stack sats, and it's similar because it takes you to a place of enlightenment that you were trying to get to with acid, or psychedelic drugs, or mushrooms,
yes,
or music. That place you're trying to get to, you can get to by stacking sats, because the aesthetic beauty of Bitcoin is transformative. Once you study the protocol and how the incentives are all perfectly balanced, and how this is perfect money, and how everything else around it is falling apart because of its presence, you have a consciousness raising experience, which is beyond what Dr. Timothy Leary could have ever imagined on his most trippy LSD trip. This is Dr. Leary to the power of Dr. Leary.
But, a lot of people had bad trips, and some people lose their minds on Bitcoin too. And we've,
Bitcoin derangement syndrome.
Bitcoin derangement syndrome. We've seen people look into Bitcoin, see Bitcoin, understand Bitcoin, and then they get a God complex and like blow their minds.
Well, this happened in the early years, but some of the early OGs flipped out, like a Charlie Shrem, for example, or a Roger Ver, who we knew in the very early years of Bitcoin. When you talk to them, their eyes would be spinning like pinwheels. If you look at the protocol for the first time, and you're one of the first people to look at it, really, sincerely, it'll literally blow your mind. And in some place, and if you're not prepared for it, it can blow your mind literally.
But there were a few trip sitters back then. It was a small community of Bitcoiners back then. So now we have more trip sitters, right? And that's an important part of tripping. I mean, actually, I've never tripped other than on Bitcoin. I've never done it. But from what I understand by reading about it, is that you need a trip sitter before you take any of these like ayahuasca and things like that. So that's part of the journey. And I just take Bitcoin. I, snort it every morning on swanbitcoin.com, by the way.
Well, I mean, it gets to the point where any psychedelic drug, it needs to be incorporated into some kind of ritual and community experience. Doing anything like this alone is always risky, and it's not recommended. And same thing with Bitcoin. That's why the community is so important. You need to be part of the Bitcoin community to help you avoid becoming strung out on Bitcoin and ending in the gutter. So, I mean, when people start selling their chairs to buy Bitcoin, you know that they've got a problem. And
they're totally hit enlightenment. They're like the up there
I envision Michael Saylor like at people's homes looking under the cushions of their sofas and dimes to buy more Bitcoin. He's a Bitcoin junkie, that guy. He needs to go to Bitcoin rehab.
No, he's gonna hit nirvana. He's literally going to like evaporate one day on air. Hopefully it's on your live stream.
Yeah.
But
he'll dematerialize.
He'll just like turn into
Exactly. He will dematerialize and enter Satoshi consciousness live on somebody's podcast. That's probably going to happen in the next 6 or 12 months. Man. This guy is so far down the rabbit hole that he met himself coming back.